Good evening. I want to welcome all of you. First, those of you who are joining us in person, and the over 300 of you who are joining us online. So I welcome you to our first book read for this academic year, as I will introduce soon our author. I want to begin, however, by recognizing that many of our Jewish siblings are unable to be here with us for tonight's event, as this is the first day of Yom Kippur. And so we wish them a blessed celebration of this holy holiday season. Also letting you all know that for those who are unable to attend this conversation, it is being recorded and will be available on the YouTube and Facebook channels of Union. This community book read marks the first public event of EDS at Union this academic year, and therefore it also provides us the first opportunity to publicly acknowledge and give thanks for the life of the very Reverend Dr. William Rankin, who served as Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School from 1993 to 1998, and who passed away on July 22nd of this year. Dr. Rankin was a social justice champion. He recognized always the special role of the church and faith leaders and their responsibility in bringing us toward a more just future. He was a loud advocate for faith and religious leaders being on the public square. And so it is apropos that we would remember him at this event as we think about the role of faith leaders, the role of the church, the role of religion on the public square, particularly at this time with the emergence or reemergence of white Christian nationalism, however we may describe this rise of religious nationalism, which we will hear more about in a few minutes. And in that regard, I know really of no one better to lead us in our thinking this evening or any time about the role and the rise of religious nationalism than my colleague, my conversation partner, and my friend, Katherine Stewart. It is a pleasure for me to have her here this evening. As we both said, this is the first time that we've met in person, and though we've talked on many occasions. And so it is so good to have her joining us. Katherine Stewart is an investigative reporter and author who has covered religious liberty, politics, policy, and education for over a decade. Her latest book, which many of you have read, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, is an exceptional and rare look inside the machinery of the movement that brought Donald Trump to power. Katherine Stewart's journalism appears in the New York Times and NBC, the New Republic, the New York Book of Reviews, and I could go on. There's indeed so much more that I could say about Katherine Stewart, but her work, her words, and her person speaks for themselves, as they all attest to the wisdom, the knowledge, the integrity, and commitment to justice that is the Katherine Stewart I've come to know. And so, please join me in welcoming to this first book read presentation and discussion. Katherine Stewart.
Thank you so much, Dean Douglas, for that amazing introduction. I'm so grateful to Union Theological Seminary for bringing me here today, and thank you so much for your own writings and inspiration, which makes the selection of the power worshipers so much more meaningful. I want to thank Miguel Escobar and also Ian Reese for helping to facilitate this visit, and I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Reiner Platt for her important work and fellowship. Above all, I'm really excited to join with all of you, this community, with a commitment to justice and peace, a dedication to the pursuit of unity and healing, and a rich tradition of intellectual inquiry. You know, my aunt used to say to me, Katherine, if you want to get along with people, don't talk about religion or politics. But we are here at this particular crisis point and can no longer afford to avoid what may be seen as impolite conversations. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about myself and my journey, what I've learned, and why it matters. And then I'd like to hear from you. I want to talk about the rising tide of illiberalism, not just in the United States, but around the world, and what it means for all of us who value true religious freedom, equality, and the promise of American democracy. So let me begin with a little bit of my story. In 2009, I was living in Santa Barbara, California, with my husband, an infant son, and a daughter in the first grade. And something happened that at first seemed too small to notice until all of a sudden it was too big to ignore. I learned that a Good News Club was coming to our daughter's public elementary school. Good News Clubs are after-school clubs designed to convert children in their very earliest years of learning to a deeply fundamentalist form of evangelical Christianity, a sort of reactionary form. And the clubs encourage kids to try to recruit their peers to the club. So we're talking little kids here. A centerpiece of the program was called the Wordless Book. It's used to convert children who are too young to read. It has no words, just pictures and shapes. And the clubs are designed to convince these children in public schools that they're going to go to hell if they don't conform to the religion of the club, and that they need to attend the supposedly right kind of church. In our community, I saw how these clubs confused very little kids into thinking that their public school endorsed a form of religion, and they would use their position inside the schools to try to recruit their classmates. At every Good News Club I attended, as I gradually began to do my research, kids were offered points or prizes or even candy for recruiting their peers to the club. I also saw that these kids were starting to target their non-Christian peers for what I could only describe as faith-based bullying and bigotry, or even the parents, kids whose families were not the right kinds of Christian. I'll never forget when a mom told me that her daughter, she signed up her daughter for a Good News Club because it seemed like a nice, way to get some religious education and such a convenient setting for free inside the public school. And her mom came home and said, Mommy, we're going to go to hell because we don't belong to the right kind of church. That child was from a Catholic family. Our school was down the road from Westmont College. It's an evangelical college, so the parent body in our public school was perhaps a third to half of evangelical. But here's the thing that really got to me and set off alarm bells. The parents that I knew in our public schools who were, affiliated with Westmont College, they were either professors or spouses of professors, they didn't want a Good News Club coming to our public school either. They were, they a group of them met with the Good News Club leaders and said, we're evangelical too, we believe in the Great Commission, but you're just not right for our school. So they offered them free space in the evangelical church next door to our school. It's a beautiful church, and the space was available at the same time for free. And the Good News Club leaders declined. So that really got me asking some questions. Why didn't these parents want a Good News Club in our public school? What did they know that I didn't? Why did the leaders insist on being in the public school in spite of this offer of free and beautiful space? What did they really believe? And above all, how is it possible for them to operate in the public schools given our constitutional principle of the separation of church and state? So that's really where my journey began. And I learned that there were thousands of Good News Clubs operating in public schools nationwide. And yet, here's what astonished me. Leaders of the Good News Clubs treated public education, public schools, with contempt. They were making use of taxpayer-funded classrooms, and yet they disparaged those classrooms and the school communities that they served. They called our schools government schools and said that they were a consequence of evil, scenes of spiritual battle. Our schools were just mission fields to them, and our children were the harvest. I came to realize that their efforts were just one part of a much larger attack on public education, and that the attack on public education was just one small part of a much larger attack on America as a modern constitutional democracy rooted in principles of, the ideals of equality, at least, if imperfectly applied. The principles of equality and pluralism represent the best of the American promise. So I made efforts to bring an understanding of this movement that I will call Christian nationalism to a broader audience. And here's where some of the real learning began, because the discoveries that I made and the way that they played out didn't always unfold in the ways that I would have anticipated. So today I want to talk about Christian nationalism more broadly. But first I want to talk a little bit about what it is and what it is not. Christian nationalism is not Christianity. It is not a religion. It is a political phenomenon that involves the exploitation of religion for political purposes. So on the one hand, I think of it as combining these two things. It's a set of ideas, an ideology. But on the other hand, it's an organized quest for power, a political movement. As an ideology, Christian nationalism boils down to the basic idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Christian here, of course, referring to a very narrow and reactionary understanding of the faith and all of its cultural implications. And this ideology says that all of our problems stem from the fact that we have forsaken this supposed heritage of that founding, the cultural heritage, the intellectual heritage of that founding. So this ideology is really a tool, and in fact, I think it's the most useful tool for a leadership-driven political machine that turns that story into political power. The machinery consists of right-wing policy groups, legal advocacy groups, pastoral initiatives. To a largely underappreciated degree, the movement operates in many instances through kind of pastor networks, or religious networks. There are networking organizations that get different parts of the leadership on the same page. You have legislative and data initiatives, and a vast far-right messaging sphere, all of the features of sort of modern political movements. And it's, they work together, very hand in glove. Their movement is diverse in terms of its, sort of specific theologies. It includes many evangelical Christians, but excludes many evangelical Christians as well, and draws in representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. The movement even derives support from some people who don't identify as Christian at all, what unites them rather than any specific theology, is more of a common political vision. It's really a means of persuading a large subsection of the American public to vote for the political candidates that the movement favors. It gives these movement leaders a lot of power and enshrines the policies that they want in law and society. So here's something to know about both aspects of Christian nationalism, the ideology as well as the political movement. They're radically anti-democratic, both in their fundamental ideas and their method of acting. Christian nationalism says that the foundation of legitimate government in the United States is grounded in, by saying it's grounded in a religion, it's saying that that's what makes us distinctive, rather than our democratic system of governance, our constitution, or a long, if imperfect, history of assimilating very diverse people in a pluralist society. The movement and its proponents reject the principles of equality and justice that represent the best of the American promise, and they're driving support for an agenda that many, if not most, Christians would regard as antithetical to their faith. Some researchers have different words, different ways of describing this movement. Some folks call it the Christian right, others call it fundamentalism. Many are calling it white Christian nationalism, and there are some very good reasons for that. One is statistical. It is correlated with social and political attitudes, including white grievance and racial animus. For many supporters, most of whom are white, although not all are white, they're buying into the idea that to be properly American, you need to be a member of a certain in-club with the correct beliefs, politics, and cultural attitudes. The ideology of Christian nationalism has deep roots in our history. It draws from the ideas of America's pro-slavery theologians, people like Robert Louis Dabney, James Henry Thornwell, and so many others, leaders of major denominations, as Frederick Douglass called them, the $5,000 divines. $5,000 was a lot of money back then. So a lot of the well-funded theologians before emancipation who said that America should be an authentically Christian nation, our laws should be rooted in the Bible, and they emphasized, the strict notion of obedience and submission for certain groups. They said hierarchies were ordained by God. Black people under white people, women under men. And these ideas were adopted and promoted by mid-century defenders of segregation. There were many folks like Bob Jones, I'm thinking of, who sort of defended segregation as God's established order. They may not have defended slavery, overtly at that time, but this idea of America as an authentically Christian nation, laws rooted in the Bible, strict obedience, hierarchies sort of rooted in God's will, and the idea that separation was somehow biblical and just. Today, many movement leaders have adopted aspects of that ideology. To be sure, very few of them are going to come out and openly admit to being racist or supporting segregation and slavery, although they'd have no trouble advocating for male supremacy and gender hierarchy in the church and in the families. Yet the lines of demarcation between pure and impure, insider and outsider, are patrolled with as much fury as ever. They actively engage in race baiting and voter suppression, schemes that disproportionately affect people of color and others in Democratic-leaning districts. They claim to stand for free speech when it suits them, but they want to whitewash our history and purge our school curricula and even public libraries of material that happens to make them feel uncomfortable. They have no problem with our former president targeting political leaders with whom he disagrees with racist smears and sexist smears. Religious nationalism has a way of dividing people between the supposedly righteous and the supposedly unrighteous. It's about symbolic boundaries. Who gets to properly belong in the nation and who does not? Sometimes it's easier to recognize when it's happening in other countries. When we see a leader like Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. We see these leaders binding themselves very tightly to reactionary religious figures in their own countries in order to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. And we rightly recognize that as a form of religious nationalism. These leaders are using religious nationalism to bubble wrap themselves in sanctimony, to guard against any democratic check on their power or critique of their corruption or nepotism and cronyism. They use religious nationalism to shield themselves from transparency regarding any abuses they may be perpetrating against their own people. They use religious nationalism to distract people from inequalities that are making their own aspects of their own countries dysfunctional. We're seeing the radical right become closer to or part of the political mainstream across a number of contemporary democracies today. The new Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, who has given speeches saying she's going to defend God, country, and family, is similarly using the language of exclusionary nationalism. Here's an interesting thing she did. She gave a speech where she said, I'm paraphrasing here, I think it was, I am a mother, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I am a Christian. Well, the most important word in that trio of words is the third, because any policy that conflicts with the agenda of religious nationalists who are supporting her political party and working with her political party will trump those other two words. So her political party, by the way, Brothers of Italy, emerged out of a neo-fascist political movement and is predictably opposed to gay marriage, abortion rights, and globalism, and collaborates closely with religious nationalist and far-right groups. There are, of course, nuances specific to different countries. The picture in every country does not look exactly the same. But the big picture is that the move toward illiberalism in various places has some remarkable similarities. One characteristic of these movements is that they are anti-democratic. They don't believe legitimate power comes from the votes of the people. They believe legitimate power comes from some devotion to religious or ethno-nationalist heritage, being a member of the right group. They don't often treat opposing political parties as legitimate. They don't sort of play well with others in that way. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who is currently facing a runoff against his political opponent, is threatening to undermine the electoral process by refusing to concede. He's saying, well, I'm not sure I'm going to step down if I lose the election. Or he's saying, well, it might be stolen. I'm seeing a lot of irregularities. This is the same thing that our former president, Donald Trump, did, denying the legitimacy of democratic elections and working to spread election lies. But it's not the only thing that Bolsonaro has done that is similar to Trump. He too has exploited reactionary forms of religious identity and religion to consolidate his power. So whether it's in Brazil or America or any number of other places, religious nationalists often govern in a similarly authoritarian manner. They target elections. They target the courts. They target the press. They go after the rights of women and sexual minorities, and they identify people who don't look like them and or worship as they do as internal enemies to scapegoat. Religious authoritarians are often unwilling to lose or concede a loss, religious nationalist authoritarians. They will go to any lengths to impose their power on others, and that is the very definition of extremism. Now, here's something you already know. Christian nationalism is damaging to both faith and the nation. By fusing certain types of Christianity, certain interpretations of the religion, with partisanship, movement leaders are damaging both the political system and religion. So I think the political damage is in some ways easier to see by locking in a base of voters around certain non-negotiable positions. Movement leaders effectively exploit conservative Christians and the Republican Party itself, and they use them to advance their many agendas unchecked. I think, for instance, the culture wars that we hear about, abortion, same-sex marriage, things like that, they're like the shiny baubles that movement leaders will dangle in front of the rank and file to get them vote a certain way. And how many of us know people who say, well, I don't like abortion, so I'm going to vote for this guy? You know, if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So they direct a lot of their messaging toward those issues, and in many instances, they create new issues, and we can talk about that later. But they create new culture war issues in order to draw in the rank and file. But so, you know, what does this look like? You know, their agenda is much more broad. So if movement leaders need the help of a cadre of super rich funders to achieve their aims, and they do, they draw a lot. It's a very well-funded movement, and they have a lot of incredibly hyper-wealthy supporters. They're going to favor lower taxes for the super rich, minimal rights for the workforce, and to secure that end, again, they'll get the rank and file to vote on abortion, or the fake CRT panic in public schools, or any other handful of culture war issues. If they want to hollow out health care, or get rid of Social Security, well, they just get the rank and file to whip themselves up in a moral panic over same-sex marriage, or blame all their problems on a tiny handful of transgender people. The religious right claims to stand for family values, but the movement drives support for politicians whose far-right economic policies are making it harder for too many American families to succeed. This hostage-taking of political parties by religious nationalist leaders also licenses the corruption of political leaders. For instance, there was nothing that Trump could steal or taint, no amount of bigotry he could enable, no amount of violence he could incite that was unacceptable, as long as he appointed pro-life judges and worked to direct a larger flow of taxpayer funding to right-wing religious organizations. But here's the thing. I think the damage to religion doesn't get enough attention. This kind of politicized religion becomes remarkably binary. It demonizes political opponents. It deifies its favored political leaders. They are chosen by God. And it's also intrinsically doomed to frustration and failure because it's tying religious or eternal aspirations to circumstantial political developments. We're a large, noisy democracy. You know, we're not all going to get everything we want. And in the face of losses in the political arena, which are really going to be inevitable for any group in a society as inherently pluralistic as ours, this kind of religion is likely to adopt an embittered view, to become nihilistic, which could lead to greater radicalization. Those who have been observing the movement for some time were aware that Christian nationalists are committed to a project that could lead to the overthrow of American democracy. But now, with former President Trump's coup attempt, along with his theft of, I don't know how many classified documents it was. Maybe one of you has an updated figure, but it was a lot. These sensitive documents pertaining to our national security, and who knows what he did with them. This movement has really crossed a Rubicon. They've actually defended him and said, we need to go after the FBI. They're the ones at fault here. Movement leaders are committed to the pursuit of power at all costs, even where it quite clearly involves a rebellion against the American government, the American constitutional system, and the undermining of our national security. So we're really at a very dangerous point, and there's nothing in American history that is quite like this. So the first lesson I want to draw from my experience is, listen to what they say. Listening is underrated. Sometimes the hardest thing to hear is when people are saying and then to take them at their word. I think we often, are inclined to reframe or reinterpret what they say in order to make ourselves feel a little more comfortable. We think, well, that's just metaphor. They're speaking metaphorically, or, we just almost sometimes don't hear what they're actually saying. But we really should try to resist that impulse. We need to listen to the movement leaders and take them at their word. They've been telling us for a very long time that they hate our democracy and want to and don't believe in pluralism and believe in minority rule by a sort of right-thinking minority over the rest of us, the imposition of their religious vision on the rest of us. So I think it is really important to pay attention to that. A decade ago, you couldn't use terms like Christian nationalism without inviting accusations of alarmism. When people brought up the extreme teachings of its leaders, the response from mainstream commentators was that this was a fringe phenomenon. These are just a few crazies at the margins. One commentator, a very prominent commentator, called it a movement that could fit into a phone booth. Well, the phone booth was installed in the White House in 2016, it refused to leave peacefully in 2020, and threatens to return in 2024. And it's not a phone booth, by the way. It's stadiums, multiple massive grand stadiums all across the country. This is a movement that has taken over one of our two major political parties. The time has come to set aside these kinds of dismissals. Here's another lesson I draw from the past decade and a half. Extremes don't necessarily correct themselves. I think we sometimes approach the political world and history itself through the lens of progress. Or we imagine everything's like a pendulum. It swings one way, it'll swing back. We think sometimes the bad stuff will just fade away and the good stuff will come forward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward. But that hasn't happened with this movement. The movement is getting ideologically harder and hotter and more extreme as it moves into the future. The past 15 years I've been going to right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings and meetings, talking with members of the leaders and the members of the leadership and the rank and file. And here's something that I've observed at recent gatherings. At the 2021 Road to Majority Conference, it's one of the major political gatherings of activists, strategists, and allied politicians, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis alluded to a passage from Ephesians that is used to invoke the idea of a spiritual war against the devil. He said, you've got to put on the full armor of God, you've got to take a stand against the left schemes. At a conference the following year, U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert said, we are soldiers in God's army engaged in spiritual warfare for our country. We can fight or we can fail. Other leaders invade that America is on the precipice, careening toward a socialist revolution, anarchy, chaos, and under the thumb of the most despicable human beings imaginable, who were referred to as, quote, the enemy, satanic, and agents of evil. We're hearing a lot of that kind of dehumanizing demon language in this movement. Former President Donald Trump spoke, and he said, the greatest danger to America is not our enemies from the outside, as powerful as they may be. The greatest enemy to America, the greatest danger to America is the destruction of our nation from the people from within. And you know the people I'm talking about. Senator Rick Scott of Florida said the backlash is coming and warned, just mount up and ride to the sound of the guns. It is time to take this country back. Folks, this is not normal. Which brings up a third point I want to share today. We should be careful of efforts to normalize the extremism that both sides are. Prior to January 6th, quite frankly, I would not have predicted that one of our major political parties would have enabled and then effectively endorsed an attempted coup against the American democratic system. I realized in retrospect, however, that I should hardly have been surprised. Hadn't I been listening to what they were saying, I realized that I, too, had been taken in by the normalizers. There are some commentators who watch a crime taking place and then tell you that it's politics as usual. When groups of people assault the Capitol and call for the deaths of public officials, they say, that's okay, they're just, exercising their frustration. When the FBI executes a search warrant as part of a criminal investigation into espionage, they frame it as part of a partisan political conflict and rush to get opinions from both sides. This is not normal. So I want to offer one last little insight, and a little more complicated than the last. The political strength of the Christian nationalist movement comes from its unity, and the unity mainly comes from the top down. The leaders of the movement have a very long-range political vision, and over the past 5 decades, we've really seen how methodically and patient the machinery of that movement has brought us to the present crisis. Just look at the Supreme Court. We read a lot these days about the conservative justices on the Supreme Court. But we don't read a lot or hear a lot about the Federalist Society, which is an extremely well-funded organization that has played an outsized role in shaping the courts and putting those justices on the Supreme Court because they have the right ideological profile. All 6 current say, right-wing justices on the Supreme Court have present or former ties to the Federalist Society. Here's another example. A lot of Republican leaders have become so much more extreme on a lot of issues. Sometimes you're just looking at the bills they're putting forward and scratching your head. But we don't hear a lot about the Christian nationalist organizations that threaten to mount primary challenges to them if they don't adopt these extreme positions. And often they do mount those primary challenges, just because of the way our political system is working and because of gerrymandering. A lot of Republican politicians will never face a challenger from the left, so they're only going to face challengers to the right. So they try and be as extreme, as hard right as possible, so that no one can run to the right of them. And they're doing that at the behest of the movement organizations which support this radical agenda. So a lot of the action in our politics is really being generated by these organizations, but we don't hear a lot about them. So why don't we hear a lot about them? Religious nationalism or ethno-authoritarianism covers itself in religious rhetoric, and that's what makes it so hard to criticize. When we critique the movement, we may be accused of being the enemy of religion itself, but we are not. Our concern, my concern, is the manipulation of faith, the weaponization of fear, the demand for obedience, the licensing of corruption, and the ways in which religious nationalism and authoritarianism are being used to divide rather than unite our country. It's interesting because a lot of the measures that the movement endorses, I believe, are designed to produce chaos, to produce anger, to make our country more polarized and less governable. And that clears the way for an authoritarian reaction, and I think that that's by design. And if you look at sort of hostile foreign powers that have collaborated and come up alongside some of America's religious nationalists and sort of see in their interest to divide our country, to increase polarization, you kind of get a sense of where they're going. I think some of the most powerful critics of Christian nationalism are Christians themselves. And of course, there are many civil liberties groups that are fighting for the preservation of our individual rights and the integrity of our voting system and democracy itself. But we are in a generational struggle. I think of the words of David Barton. He's one of the sort of most popular Christian nationalist myth makers. I call him in my book the Where's Waldo of the movement because he's everywhere. He's on a number of initiatives, and he's involved in politics and policy and data and all this kind of stuff. pastoral initiatives. So he wrote some time ago to his people, he said, commit yourself to this engagement for the long haul, for the duration. Arm yourself with the mentality of a marathon runner, not a sprinter. He's right. We're in a generational struggle. There's no easy solution. But, I feel like the tools of democracy are still available to those of us who reject this agenda. And we can't forget that we are the majority. Most Americans do not agree with this agenda. And we have the power. We really just need to use it. I'm often asked, where do you find hope? And I think of you, Reverend Douglas, with your own powerful writings, with your own powerful words. As you've said, the hope is in the struggle. You spoke of your ancestors who struggled for freedom, even when they knew they would never experience it themselves. They struggled on behalf, as you've said, of people they would never see. They are our heroes. They should be examples to us all. None of us can predict the future, but we are all in this together. We care about one another, and we care about our democracy, and everyone has a role to play. Religious nationalists are working to destroy our democracy. I continue to believe that those same tools can be used to restore it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There is much for us to be in conversation about, hopeful and frightening. Before we begin open our question and answers to question session to those of you here as well as those online, we will engage in a conversation with our guest, and we are equally as privileged to have joining us in this conversation this evening Elizabeth Reiner Platt, who is the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School. Before joining Columbia, she was a staff attorney at MFY Legal Services Mental Health Law Project. After graduating from New York University School of Law, she was a Carr Center for Reproductive Justice Fellow at A Better Balance. During law school, she worked with the Urban Justice Sex Workers Project, New York Civil Liberties Union, and Brennan Center for Justice. She's published The Gangsters to Greyhounds, The Past, Present, and Future of Offender Registration. We are so privileged to have her with us, and thank you for joining us in this very important conversation this evening. And we hope this is only the beginning of the kind of collaboration that we will have between the Episcopal Divinity School at Union and the law school and the I always get it wrong, the Rights and Religion Project at Columbia. So we will begin with a conversation and then open it to those of you for questions. So I'm going to take my seat. And let me begin with a question, and then would you two take it over? First of all, I want to sort of begin in many respects with a theme that seemed to be running through your talk, Katherine, and that brings religion and law together. We hadn't noticed, perhaps, some of the things that were happening that led to the Dobbs decision, and so many were surprised by the Dobbs decision. And of course, upon reading your book, we shouldn't have been surprised. One of the things, while we were focused on Dobbs, that perhaps we didn't notice was the decision that came out shortly after Dobbs concerning religious liberty. Again, a very significant decision, and now we see religious liberty coming together in such a way, and the legal arguments coming forward with religious liberty, that are a part, perhaps, of this religious right narrative, and how religious liberty now is becoming sort of that. They won't talk about other forms of discrimination, but if we can bring this under the umbrella of religious liberty, then we can begin to discriminate against all kinds of people, as well as, of course, make religious liberty this priority right over sort of racial rights for racial freedom, gender freedom, et cetera, et cetera. Religious liberty becomes a priority right. How is religious liberty then being used as this tool to empower even further the rise of the religious right? And how are they indeed engaging our justice system through this argument of religious liberty? So I'm going to leave that to you. Who wants to begin?
Well, I'll get started. True religious liberty is the freedom of thought, conscience, and worship. It's the freedom to worship any god or sacred idea or none, to worship as you choose. And it also includes the right from being compelled to worship if you don't want to, any religion if you don't want to, the right to not have to support any religion you don't want to, if you don't want to, with your money. But in the hands of this sort of movement, religious freedom, the concept of religious freedom has been sort of recast to mean its opposite. It's the right to discriminate against people, not just discriminate personally against people of whom you disapprove, but also the idea that the government should be allowed to direct its contempt towards people who are not worthy of respect. It is also, I think, to an underappreciated degree, a lot of the religious liberty, so-called religious liberty activity, this movement, is really a demand for public funding. They want the public to fund their schools, their right-wing religious initiatives. They want the right to have proselytizing organizations subsidized by the tax dollar, by our tax dollars. They want, you see this most obviously, I would say, in the field of public education, where decisions such as Carson versus Macon and other decisions, Carson versus Macon was this case in the state of Maine involving taxpayer funding of religious schools. There are a number of decisions where they're actually sort of widening the spectrum of, widening the flow of, increasing the flow of taxpayer funding to religious schools. And this is something that taxpayers have rejected over and over in various ballot measures and have disagreed with for a very long time, but they want that money. They know that if they can claim a portion of the money that's flowing to public schools, which are open to all, all students, all families, all abilities, then if they can sort of widen that, open that spigot wider, the money will flow without end. You want to?
So yeah, Elizabeth, and while we're focused on Dobbs, did we miss something really important here in the decision on religious liberty?
So I think you're referring to the Kennedy v. Bremerton decision,
yes,
which
exactly
is the football coach who took what really should have been an establishment clause case. Can a public actor pray in a way that is inviting students to engage in religious exercise during a public school event, and turned it into a free exercise claim that was about his rights And his kind of position of victimhood of saying, I was fired from my job because of exercising on my deeply held religious beliefs. And I think that's a narrative that's been incredibly powerful. If you look at kind of narratives of not just free exercise, but also often the narrative of religious discrimination, the court has been extraordinarily sensitive to claims of religious discrimination from certain claimants. So you'll see cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop, where the court said, actually, the real victim of discrimination here were not the folks turned away from the cake. It was the person who was sued for anti-LGBTQ discrimination. He was actually treated so poorly during his hearing that actually that itself is unconstitutional. Similarly, if you look at it, well, this was not squarely a free exercise case, but like if you look at some of the language in cases involving crisis pregnancy centers, there's this kind of language of, oh, these are just, these Christian groups who are, this is not a public health measure trying to make sure that crisis pregnancy centers, aren't lying to people who come into them. It's really about targeting religious actors for discrimination. Whereas if you flip it, if you look at voting rights cases, if you look at the Muslim ban case, where's the discrimination? The Supreme Court just can't see it. So I think that's another kind of narrative that's going on, is this use of free exercise to make it, entirely about the particular claimant's narrative coming forward and kind of miss all of the other people at play here, whether it's the students on the field, whether it's the parents in the stands, whether it's the people being turned away, from a public store or what have you.
Yeah, it's interesting, a lot of these cases hinge on this idea that religion is not religion, it's just speech from a certain point of view, so that these activities should be protected by the free speech clause of the First Amendment. So it does beg the question, is religion just speech from a certain point of view? Not according to our tax code. Religions enjoy specific tax privileges that other for-profit and non-profit organizations don't enjoy. They have special benefits like parsonage exemptions. They don't have to open their books to the IRS the same way non-religious nonprofits don't. So they're treated very differently in our tax code. They're treated very different in our legal code. Religions are allowed to discriminate. They can discriminate against people of other faiths, against women, against LGBT people, and any number of other folks. But so they have this very distinct, and here's the other thing, they have a very separate place in our First Amendment. The first clause of our First Amendment is the religion clauses, including the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, which is distinct from the Free Speech Clause in our First Amendment. In fact, the Establishment Clause has the best piece of real estate in our First Amendment. It's the first clause of the First Amendment. I think that it was put there for a reason, but the way the sort of so-called originalists, right-wing justices are trying to do it, they're really trying to have it both ways. Religion is religion when they want their special tax privileges and their right to discriminate and all of that, but they claim they're just, it's just free speech, just speech like any other form of speech when they want to insert their programs into the public schools and things like that. So they're really trying to have their cake and eat it too.
So what you call the originalists, and we now see the Supreme Court being literalists, right? What we might call in this school biblical literalists, and you sort of referred to that in your talk. They're becoming constitutional literalists. So what now happens when, for instance, religious freedom of speech, freedom of religion are mentioned in the Constitution, but race isn't mentioned in the Constitution, right?
Neither is public funding of religious schools. Neither is the right to own an AK-47. I mean, there's a lot that's not in there. They'll find the meanings as they look for it. Yeah.
That's right, but they use, so, but now these constitutional literalists, right, are saying the rights that are not literally mentioned there are not rights that we don't have to defend. And so that it gives them this leeway, right, through religious liberty, to then say that we defend the right of religious liberty because that's in the Constitution, but that trumps gender freedom, racial equality, and so that's why you told us to listen to what they say. We have heard Alito, we have heard Clarence Thomas say, oh, now we can go back and look at how the court had overstepped, overreached, gotten out of step with the Constitution because race, gender, these things aren't there, but religious liberty is there. What say you?
Yeah, I've heard someone else refer to it as peer pressure from the dead, which I thought was also very compelling. I think this has been the road the court has been going for a long time. I think maybe it's more explicit now, but I think, what did Kagan say? We're all originalists now. So it's been, the kind of a dominant, if not the dominant, way of looking at things for a long time. So I think another a lead up, another clue that I think maybe we missed in all of this was the COVID cases. That was a series of cases that were, first of all, entirely on the shadow docket, meaning that the court issued opinions without any briefing, without any oral argument, all kind of under the radar. That said, anytime a law contains any secular exception, it is, again, discrimination for it not to include a religious exception. So the context was, in these COVID regulations, well, if we allow people in grocery stores to buy food, we have to allow, a private group worship to meet in violation of these gathering bans that were put in place in the height of the pandemic. And I think what was notable was not only was that was a completely different vision of discrimination than we use in any other area of the law, particularly in race discrimination, but it also was just this sense of absolute, 10-alarm emergency of this violation of rights when what were the other cases that the court was simultaneously ignoring? Cases involving prisoners, stuck in horrible conditions who were getting COVID, cases involving even speech, even cases brought by the Republican Party saying that they had a right to meet, certainly cases involving abortion, the Republican governments using kind of the COVID pandemic as an excuse to shut down abortion clinics because they said it wasn't necessary. So I think, I think originalism is a very convenient kind of legally way to go about it, but you can also see this thread of like, what is the emergency? Where are we going to get involved? What is important and what's not?
So Katherine, you have laid out, following up on this, in your book, how, this has been a long game for the religious right. And what's happening now? Well, they've moved toward this. They've planned this. So how much are they behind all of this? What is their role in the way in which we now see, for instance, what is happening in our courts, not simply in terms of the ways in which you've talked about, they were very clear in who they wanted to get into power, but the way in which we are seeing the narrative change in this regard, in these various ways.
A lot of money buys a lot of law. I mean, the movement's legal advocacy groups are incredibly well funded. When I started researching this issue, one of the leading legal advocacy groups, the Alliance Defending Freedom, I believe their annual operating budget was like maybe $30 million, $40 million. It's a lot of money. By 2018, it had ballooned to $60 million, and in the 2020-2021 fiscal year budget, it had increased to $102 million a year. That's just one of the legal advocacy organizations pushing this agenda that is basically distorting what religious liberty is There's other organizations like Liberty Council, First Liberty Institute, the Pacific Justice Institute, there are ACLJ, there are a number of others, and they're aiming at the Establishment Clause, and it's having a lot of consequences on the ground. I want to say one more thing about originalism. This originalism is really just gaslighting. This is a court that will find rights that didn't exist in our Constitution and will pull them out of the very teeth of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, such as, the right to of religious schools to receive taxpayer funding and things like that. So one thing that right-wing Supreme Court justices keep talking about these days very openly is history and tradition. History and tradition has become a sort of a buzz phrase. I remember during Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, he was asked by John Cornyn and Ted Cruz and several other folks, how will you look at at First Amendment cases or religious freedom cases? And he repeated that phrase a number of times. Alito has repeated that phrase a number of times. Whose history and whose tradition do you think they are going to tap, and who do they intend to serve?
Elizabeth, I saw you trying to jump in. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just was adding to the already very long list of legal advocacy groups. I muttered Thomas More Society under my breath.
So, religious liberty becomes sort of a mask to do other things. You have pointed out in your book the way in which, in many ways, Roe v. Wade and the sort of fight against Roe v. Wade and the fight against abortion rights wasn't the religious right's original intent, was a mask to discriminate. And because they could not go out and campaign for segregated schools. Can you speak to that?
Sure. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, a movement began to arise. It included people like Paul Weyrich, Phyllis Schlafly, Alan Dye, Howard Phillips. They called themselves the New Right. They were very disillusioned with the direction of the Republican Party. They felt it had become too liberal, too soft on communism. They were very upset about the civil rights movement. They were upset about the women's, a lot of sort of progressive moves in our society, and they really wanted to drag the Republican Party to the right. They said, we are not conservatives, we are radicals, as one of the, we are the forces of change, as one of their affiliated members put it. They really wanted to change the order. And they needed an issue to unite their movement. And they were also allied with a number of conservative preachers, Bob Jones and the like. And the thing that, they were upset about all these different things, but the thing that really got them up in the morning was the fact that the IRS was starting to look at racially segregated religious schools that a lot of these preachers like Bob Jones were running. They were segregation academies. They had been set up after Brown versus Board of Education, when a lot of white families didn't want to send their children to school with black children. So these preachers would set up these religious schools that were segregating, that were discriminating. They were often referred to as segregation academies. The IRS was starting to look at them and say, why aren't we subsidizing these schools? Why are we subsidizing, segregation with our tax dollars? And that really upset them. They just like, oh, this is just a terrible outrage. How dare they take away our public money for our schools? How dare they take away our tax privileges? But this was going to be, as you said, a sort of ugly rallying cry for their movement. They needed something else. So they were having these gatherings, and this historian, Randall Ballmer, at Dartmouth, he's sort of part of some of the discussions with members of this movement. He's written about this very persuasively, and they went down a kind of list of issues that they could use to unite their movement. School prayer was one, but it tended to alienate the Catholics, and they couldn't use the issue of segregation. What about the ERA? Well, that was going down in flames. So, but they got to abortion, it was like a light bulb went off. And they were like, that could actually work. And over time, they purged pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. And it took a lot of work. Phyllis Schlafly wrote a really terrific book about it. It's called How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. It wasn't pro-life. At the time, and what it shows, it took just a tremendous amount of work over time. But when Roe v. Wade passed, people forget that most Protestant Republicans supported it. The Southern Baptist Convention passed resolutions in 1971, 1974, affirming support for abortion law liberalization. Barry Goldwater, that conservative hero, he supported abortion law liberalization, at least early in his career. And his wife, Peggy, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood. I mean, can you imagine a conservative leader's spouse doing that today? But, they thought they thought this was a Catholic issue. Even Billy Graham said, I disagree with, the Catholic stance. He said, I disagree with that. And he said, I believe in Planned Parenthood. Billy Graham said that. But over time, they needed unity for their movement. They knew if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So after a lot of work and sort of, political shenanigans that Schlafly and some of her cohort got involved with, we got to a point where it's like all abortion all the time. But we can't forget that the abortion issue is really a political issue, and it was created for political purposes. It's a modern creation.
Thank you. Before we open it up, Elizabeth, I want to give you a chance to engage.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I chew on a lot, and I'd also invite your kind of responses to this, is whether the language of using religion to discriminate gets us bound into a conversation about sincerity that is not helpful. To my mind, it doesn't matter if they're it doesn't matter if they're sincere religious beliefs. And for many, rank and file in that time, they were, I know the Southern Baptist Convention formal stance was, in support, but many rank and file then and now, do have sincere religious beliefs that I adamantly oppose. But I wonder if the focus on the using is helpful versus just the actual real-world impact on us all of the actual exemption or the policy being demanded, or whether there might be some distinction that we're making that would be helpful between kind of the drivers of the movement versus the kind of rank and file of the movement.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely a leadership-driven, organization-driven movement. It's not led by the rank and file. The power of the movement comes from mobilizing the votes of the rank and file, but they're not the source of its ideas.
Which is why the single issue thing becomes important, right? Because sometimes we scratch our heads and say, they're voting against their self-interest. But if you get them to vote on a single issue like abortion, then it's easier to get them to vote against other self-interest. I think I have a question from online and then...
Yes, so we're going to turn to the questions now, both from in-person and online. As Dean Kelly mentioned, we have about 350 people watching this evening. And for the questions online, we're going to be very COVID safe. So when you're asking a question, if you could keep your mask on, and then I will also wipe the microphone between folks. So let me ask this first question here. This question comes from Reverend Dr. Jan Carlson-Boole. In the process of interacting with anyone or group who is or allies with Christian nationalism, how might you speak to and listen to the underlying currents of fear that fuel this tsunami of dogma and certainty? How to balance listening and speaking and to use the power of story in so doing? So
I guess the question is about how to listen to people who are sort of caught up in religious nationalism and how to engage in productive conversations. You know, I think listening is underrated. Listening is really important, and one can always find common ground with people. But the challenge with this movement is that there's been so much misinformation, so much propaganda, so much conspiracism, which makes the rank and file immune to certain types of information and susceptible to believing in certain kinds of conspiracism, that it can become very difficult. I think, I don't know about you guys, but I think probably most of us have people in our worlds, whether members of our own families or members of friend groups or houses of worship, who it's very hard to kind of agree on certain kinds of facts. I mean, I think about the lie of the stolen election. It reminds me of when I went to that Reawaken America tour not too long ago. One of Mike Flynn's it's like a traveling pro-Trump roadshow. You go in there and there's every conspiracy imaginable. You've got great replacement, they're talking about, there's QAnon folks there, there are people who, there's all kinds of medical misinformation. But the one lie that the one conspiracy that not every person at that event bought into every conspiracy, but the one conspiracy that they had all bought into was the lie of the stolen election. And those lies, that kind of misinformation was spread not just by our former president himself, but a lot of it was spread through religious nationalist networks, where you had presentations in churches, presentations targeting pastors with an elections integrity specialist who was there to spread misinformation. So that really does make it a challenge. I wish there was an easy answer.
Yeah. I turn to those who are here, if you have a question. I saw you first, so. Do I stand up, sir? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. My question is to the panel, please, and I would like to ask about, as we are observing now, minority groups joining the ranks of Christian nationalist movements, what is it that these movements are doing that minority groups so easily join them, rationally thinking as well? Because I do not believe for a second that their choice to join them is illogical, because as we look at their blogs and video blogs that they're leaving for the public to view, they are very, very rational and the way that they choose to join them. Thank you.
I'd love to speak to that, if that's all right. Movement leaders recognize the demographic future as clearly as you or I can, and they recognize that they need to find, their numbers are shrinking, they need to find new supporters. And one of the things, and they're also very sensitive, I believe, to accusations of racism, and one thing that they've done is reach out to conservative-leaning pastors of color and draw them into networks and give them all this messaging material and stuff like that. If you look at, for instance, I've been to, there are these groups like Ministros Hispanos, or groups del Sur de Florida, or like groups like Pastores Unidos, which is another group in California. There are groups of conservative-leaning pastors, Spanish-speaking, Latino and Hispanic, who've been drawn into these networks. So I went to one of these gatherings where, they're spreading lies about sex education, health education material that's being taught in the public schools. Look, I'm a mom, I've got 2 kids that were in public schools, and they were passing out these materials, and they're like, this is being taught in your kid's public school. I'm looking at this handout, and it's got stuff on. I'm like, it's alarming. I'm like, are they teaching this in the schools? So I had to do some fact checking, and I called up, various, school departments, LASUD, Los Angeles Public School Department, San Francisco Public School Department, to figure out if the materials that they're suggesting are being taught for these particular age groups are actually in the public schools. nothing on this flyer, nothing on this handout was being taught in the manner suggested or to the age group suggested. Materials that they're saying they're teaching in K through 3 are being taught at the high school level, where it's appropriate to learn different kinds of lessons, but not appropriate in K through 3. And then a lot of the materials that they're suggesting are being taught in the public schools were not being taught anywhere in the public school system at all. But they get people upset about this stuff, and then they sort of actually gave them a list of, politicians, local politicians, and said, these politicians are supporting the California Healthy Youth Act. It was like a list of maybe 74 politicians, and all but one, and I mean of every, school board members, et cetera, and all but one were Democrats. So and then they sort of deliver materials, voter guides, videos to air at church, and the like. I mean, that's just only one example. I mean, I'll give you another example. I was looking into the reason for the shifting Latino vote in between 2016 and 2020. Overall, the Latino vote shifted substantially in Trump's favor. And I was looking at these Facebook pages that are targeting Latinos. I was looking at Latinos of Plainfield. It's a Facebook page. And it's a place where a lot of people go for to learn about jobs or to learn about various community resources and like essential services or things that would be useful to them, housing, et cetera. And there are all of these memes, these anti-abortion memes being pushed, these anti-Biden memes being pushed, but a lot of stuff with very religious content, like these, Democrats are satanic and, they're aborting kids after they're born, all this kind of stuff. So people might not be looking for this material. They're looking for, say, you're looking for a job or a place to live or something, but you're seeing all this stuff. So there's a lot of misinformation being targeted to specific groups, and I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing that kind of a shift. Another reason, by the way, is radio networks. There are radio networks, in particular, targeting Spanish-speaking people in America that are run by people with a right-wing and sort of religious right agenda, and they're putting that kind of programming out there. So these types of programs are very effective, and they're being targeted specifically in certain districts, in certain communities.
I don't know if other members of the panel wanted to speak to that.
I can add one I think this is a much, much, much smaller piece of the puzzle than what Katherine just outlined, but I will just note that, as you already said, there's a huge amount of money going into these firms litigating religious liberty issues. Many of them really exclusively work for conservative Christians, but some of them will take cases of people from a variety of religious groups, and some of these groups do have really strong reputations as defenders of religious liberty among, local mosques, local Sikh communities, because these are the folks that are willing to have the expertise and to go out there and litigate when, a community is trying to use a zoning code to close a mosque, for example. So I'll just add that.
I think I saw a number of questions from this side, so I'm going to go to you. Red glasses. I saw you first.
Thank you. So you guys were talking about education, and then you mentioned COVID, and I'm thinking a lot about the early signs and how at the top of COVID, school board meetings were getting flooded with, the right to wear a mask, what shouldn't be the right, vaccinations, et cetera. And then fast forward where we are now, you've got more folks running for a school board who are extremely right-wing than you've seen in the past 10 or so years. I say that because I sit on a school board in Newark, New Jersey, which is predominantly Democrat, predominantly left, but when I engage with fellow school board members across the country from other districts, they talk about how most people, students, parents even, in the districts didn't even know about school boards and the function of them until this major kind of right-wing movement. And so my question is about the kids, right? There are a lot of young people whose first introduction to people using their democratic power to utilize freedom of speech through these really extreme school board meetings or political takes from the DeSantises of the world. And so what are we to say to young people whose first introduction to their actual rights, right, and what utilizing their rights like freedom of speech look like in the public square is one that is so corrupted and corrosive? How do we reinstill notions of civic virtue, not only for this generation, but for the next, at a time where there are very few models of healthy, representations of what that should look like?
Good question.
I would love to hear your response to that if you're.
Oh, but see, they can hear me anytime. So I will give a brief opening salvo to let you all collect your thoughts and then respond. First of all, I think that's a very good question, and I think, as Katherine's written about in her book and others, that we've got to get involved in local politics. I think that is right. I think that we also know that it's one of the reasons they're trying to control the narrative of what goes on in schools, because they're shaping the next generation and what they think. And so we really have to get involved. As one, Richard Rothstein, legal scholar, once said, if we don't begin to tell our children a different history and a different narrative than we can't expect them to be any better at promoting racial justice, in particular, than this generation. But the last thing I will say is this becomes, as I look at people in this room, almost the role of our faith communities have to take more seriously their role in education. And we know, and I'll say from the experience of my wider faith, the Black faith tradition, we know that when the Black faith tradition has been at its best, and historically, right, we knew what was going to happen in the public schools and in the public square in terms of our children, and what they weren't going to get, what was going to be missing from their education, and how they would not be affirmed. And so what did the Black church and faith tradition do? It took responsibility for educating, as they would say, filling in the gaps. And so I'll stop there. So I think there's a significant role for faith community to play in this. So now I gave you all the opening salvo.
Amen.
Yeah, I think we've put kids in like an impossible position, and I think the first thing that really came top of mind when you asked that question is just issues of personal safety. It's easy to say go out there and protest and stand up and put your name out there, but it's a lot to ask of someone in a situation where people are getting death threats for giving trans-affirming care to their patients. I mean, someone who would not even be on the radar of anyone previously, pre-internet, like some individual doctor in their community just trying to do their job, are getting death threats. And so I don't, it's pretty dark. I don't really have an answer to you in terms of how can we expect the kids to step up in that kind of environment, and it's something I'm going to keep chewing on that question because I think it's really important.
Great. So I have a question from the online audience, and it begins with an assertion. So a bigger threat than Christian nationalism is the threat of putting Christianity on the ballot. Since these Christian nationalists do not represent the church or Christianity and are not the same people who go to church, why equate Christianity with white nationalism at all, unless you want to put Christianity on the ballot?
Thanks for that question. Christian nationalism draws in some people who don't particularly, go to church very often, if at all, but are just sort of taking on that religious nationalist ideology and agreeing with ideas about, America being a Christian nation, et cetera, et cetera. Christian nationalism also, large sector of the rank and file also is very much church-going, and they worship with as much passion and sincerity as anyone. But here's the thing. Christian nationalism is not just defined by the attitudes of the rank and file. It's a leadership-driven political movement. It's a political pathology that affects political systems and is not like a theory, embraced by millions of supporters. It's not just that. It's also this sort of leadership-driven movement. I'm thinking about some of the movements, like key leaders of different features of the different organizational, pieces, like Tony Perkins of the Alliance Defending Freedom, Bob McEwen of the Council for National Policy, Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, or people like Michael P. Ferris, who's the former head of the Alliance Defending Freedom, and now Kristen Wagoner, Christiane Hawkins of Students United for Life. You cannot tell me these people are not Christian. They are very sincere in their beliefs, or at least appear to be very sincere in their beliefs. And I do believe that they're sincere in their beliefs. So, a lot of people make a lot of people who are, saying people who are embracing Christian nationalists don't all go to church. But it's more than a movement that's defined by the attitudes in the rank and file. It's like a political pathology that affects political systems.
I think we have time for one last question. So brief question and quick answer.
I saw him first. Sorry. Thank you. This has been really, really interesting. And early on, you mentioned that there was participation from people who also were not religiously Christian, and people who would, strongly disagree with being labeled that way. Where are those people coming from, and how is that coalition being held together? What are the issues being mobilized to keep people who are, in the eyes of somebody with a very fundamentalist theology, hellbound in coalition with those same fundamentalists? That must be a really interesting dynamic to observe.
I think the money part of this is very poorly understood. So a lot of the big funders, look, the sort of class of people who are super, super wealthy is diverse, and some of them are very progressive. But there is a cohort of super wealthy people, a subsection of the super, super wealthy, that devote a tremendous amount of money to this movement. Something like, the family of Betsy DeVos has devoted over time hundreds of millions of dollars to build up organizations like the Family Research Council and Focus on the Family and the like. And they've donated a tremendous amount of money to very political preachers like D. James Kennedy, who was a sort of anti-public school, big voice in opposition to public education. I find that very interesting. Her family gave him at least $5.5 million and probably more. So a lot of the folks, like the big funders, not so much Betsy or DeVos, but maybe some others, I believe are as committed, if not more committed, to far-right economic positions as they are to right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars. They want low taxes or no taxes for the rich. They want minimal regulation of business. They want minimal regulation or no regulation of the environment. They want minimal rights for the workforce. But how do you get people to vote for those things? Well, you give them those little culture war issues, which, can be big culture war issues. But you ever see, it's like a pointer, it puts a red mark in people, like cats play with it. I think of sometimes those culture war issues is like that cat toy. Oh, look, get those people over here so they don't notice that you're gutting their health care. Oh, but get them upset about this, there's a trans athlete over there, but they're gutting our health care. But don't look at that, look at this thing. So I think it's a little bit like that. So I do know that there are some, big funders who seem somewhat insincere, and they're, we can't know what's in people's hearts, but are absolutely committed to the politics of low taxation for the rich, no taxation, so.
Well, clearly, this is only the beginning of a very important conversation. And I hope that all of you here and all of you online continue this conversation and continue to take very seriously this issue of the rise of the religious right and the way it has come together with what is going on in our courts and in our legal system. As you have said, we've got to listen. We have missed it up to this point, and we cannot afford to continue to miss the issues at hand. I want to thank you both for a very engaging conversation. We have all been enriched by it. And so thank you for your work. Thank you for your work. And thank you for this evening.
Thank you.